Okay, so this is my review of Daniel T Willingham's Why Don't Students Like School? In terms of schema creation, there wasn't really any. There was a kind of a pat use of a question and answer format that aimed to answer questions that weren't really questions that I felt the teacher would ever have asked. Here's our example. So, why don't students like school? I've never really thought to ask that. How can I teach the students the skills they need when standardized tests require only facts? Again, not something I've ever asked as a teacher. Why do students remember everything that's on television and forget everything I say? I don't think that's true in any sense, so that's not a question I'd ever ask. Why is it so hard for students to understand abstract ideas? Again, never thought about that. Is drilling worth it? My answer to that would be yes, and move on. What's the secret to getting students to think like real scientists, mathematicians, and historians? I don't think there is a secret, or necessarily that's even that important. What you need to do is teach students as much knowledge as possible, and then eventually they'll pick up those skills. Obviously you can expose them to that in a small aspect, but it's really not the key to education, I feel. 7, how should I adjust my teaching for different types of learners? That's obviously a packed question that is clearly going to give them a chance to talk about learning styles, which is the current whipping boy of education, and we all get that. Chapter 8, how can I help slow learners? Again, that's not really a PC term I think any teacher would ever use, so I don't feel that's a question I would definitely ask for sure. And then chapter 9, what about my mind? What about my mind? Obviously is the intonation he's aiming for, but again, that's not a question I'm interested in. But despite that, the book was actually quite interesting. But the kind of schema creation of, we're answering these questions that you've never had in your mind before, I found a bit naff. In terms of the arguments and the points, I found them broadly agreeable. There wasn't anything particularly new, which is why, for me, the book wasn't especially interesting, just because these points are things that I'm well aware of already. And so I agreed with most of them, but perhaps they could have been made a bit more succinctly. Now, this to me is obviously a key part of what I think all good books should have, especially the types that we're talking about here, self-help, education, and so on. I just didn't feel the illustrations or the examples were that interesting or engaging that were provided. Too often, obviously, he's not a teacher himself, so too often it was examples from another teacher provided to him, like, sort of a third-hand story. I've heard of a geography teacher who said, rather than a practitioner who actually is telling you things that happen to them, and things that sort of synthesize what you already know and what you feel about students and their engagement and interactions with your class. In terms of the audience, I think this is really good for sort of like first year uni, maybe third year uni. I'm not really familiar. It's been a while since I was in my undergrad, but I give this to maybe student teachers, early career teachers, and people who I felt weren't across what they needed to in terms of cognitive science and how it affects learning. The only real omission in question I have is, I believe it was chapter 7. There was no mention of students that weren't neurotypical, so he talks about slow students and he gives a lot of sports analogies between the capable athlete and the incapable athlete. And obviously in both of those examples, the thing that's being left out is students with a disability, and in the education examples, learning disabilities. And leaving those out completely just seems like a really uncomfortable thing to talk about for an entire chapter, or quite a long chapter, and to leave out an entire group of our population, which we should be most interested in supporting, I felt a bit uncomfortable about. So as I said, there's a separate video for the highlights of this book that you can look at. I'll link it in the description.